Taurus. There's a chair in your family home that used to be occupied more often than it is now. Nobody talks about it out loud. Nobody asks directly. But everyone notices, in a somewhat unsettling way, that the person who was a Taurus, the pillar, the safe haven, the right-hand person at Sunday lunches, has been visiting less frequently without any warning. No arguments, no farewell speeches, just a slow, almost polite distancing, the start of which nobody knows exactly. And the easiest explanation always appears too quickly. He changed. He became proud. His heart cooled. But anyone who has ever observed a Taurus person closely knows that this explanation doesn't hold water, because coldness isn't quite the right word to describe someone who still remembers everyone's birthday, who still pays the bill without asking, who still secretly harbors enormous affection for those same people he's distancing himself from. There's an almost automatic belief that Taurus is the most home-loving sign of the zodiac, the guardian of tradition, the one who never cuts ties, who values family above almost everything, who prefers the familiar to the new. And to a certain extent, that's true. But that same root that seems so firm on the outside has learned at some point in life to ration its own sap. Like a tree that has gone through a silent drought and decided, without telling anyone, which branches were still worth keeping alive. If this root is so strong, why does it sometimes choose to distance itself from its own soil? The answer begins to appear when one understands that for Taurus, emotional closeness is not an infinite resource. It is finite, precious. And when the surrounding environment becomes unstable, unpredictable, or simply too painful, some ancient and sensible part within decides to gather this energy before it is completely depleted. The primary reason for this distancing stems precisely from this mechanism, which is rarely correctly named. For Taurus, silence is not usually punishment. It's not the famous silent treatment that other signs use to hurt back. It's something else, more like a closed door in a specific room of the house, not to exclude those outside, but to muffle a sound that already hurts too much to hear every day. When family life is fraught with old resentments, unspoken expectations, or a constant feeling of being pressured about something that was never agreed upon, Taurus doesn't usually explode. They withdraw, gradually, sometimes physically, almost always emotionally. And the most curious thing is that this withdrawal stems from a place of care, not indifference. They distance themselves precisely to avoid saying, in a moment of anger, something they wouldn't be able to undo later. Some people mistake this for lack of love because they expect noise as proof of importance. They expect arguments, demands, tears, some scene that confirms the relationship still means something, but Taurus rarely delivers that kind of proof. Their silence is dense, carrying within it everything that hasn't been said, but outwardly it seems like resignation. And it's this deceptive appearance that makes the family misinterpret what is being deeply felt on the other side. There's a subtle difference between someone who walks away because they've stopped caring and someone who walks away because they care too much and don't know what to do with it anymore. The second type is the wounded bull, who no longer trusts their ability to remain calm when faced with the same pain too closely. But what happens when this silence, created to protect the relationship, begins to become the only language left between them? When no one argues anymore, but no one truly opens up either. When the peace that seemed to have finally arrived is, in reality, just the absence of any new attempt. It was while searching for answers to this that I found this digital book, The Divine Path That Guides Your Zodiac Sign to a Life of Purpose, isn't about fixing other people's families or forcing reconciliations that aren't ready yet. It talks about something much more basic and much more urgent for those born under the sign of Taurus, learning to build emotional security from the inside out, without needing to distance themselves from everything to feel protected. It's almost a mental posture, a way of internally reorganizing what Taurus has always tried to solve alone, without asking anyone for help. If you've made it this far, it's quite likely that some part of this story has affected you. Perhaps a name came to mind, or the specific memory of a silence you yourself created. This discomfort is no coincidence, and it doesn't usually disappear on its own, just because the video ends. It demands some action, even a small one, while it's still fresh. The link is in the first pinned comment, but be aware, this content may be taken down. Click now and download your copy. Meanwhile, leave a comment below. Is there someone in your family you've drifted apart from and never been able to explain exactly why? Long before any physical distance existed, there was a child who learned, without anyone saying it aloud, that feeling too much was a problem to be solved quickly. Perhaps it was in a house too full of people and opinions, where crying loudly meant disturbing the atmosphere. Perhaps it was in a house too quiet, where no emotion had space to exist without being interpreted as weakness. One way or another, this Taurus child learned early on a lesson they would carry for the rest of their life. It was safer to keep things to themselves than to expose them. It's like that plant that grows at an angle, not because it was born crooked, but because the light it needed always came from a difficult angle to reach. Over time, the stem itself gets used to the inclination. Straightening it again hurts. It even seems wrong, unnatural, even though it's the healthiest path. And that's exactly how the adult silence of Taurus is formed, not as a conscious choice, but as an old adaptation that has never been revised. The problem is that what worked to protect a small child begins to take a heavy toll on an adult who already has the resources to deal with discomfort in a different way. Keeping everything bottled up, always with everyone, creates a loneliness that no one sees from the outside. Because outwardly, this Taurus remains stable, present, and reliable. But inside, each unspoken resentment becomes another brick in a wall that sooner or later will separate him from those he loves most. There's a curious detail in this process. The more stable this Taurus seems to others, the harder it becomes for him to admit that he also needs comfort, a listening ear, someone to ask how he really is without expecting the usual automatic answer. The family usually gets so used to his strength that they stop asking. And he, in turn, gets so used to not being asked that he stops expecting it. It's a silent, self-reinforcing cycle that no one notices until it's already well underway. There's also a physical layer to all of this, because Taurus processes emotion through the body before processing it through the mind. A tightness in the chest, tension in the shoulders, a tiredness that isn't physical but settles in as if it were. When the child learned not to bother others, the body learned along with it to store the tension instead of releasing it in words. And it is this adult body, burdened with years of accumulated tension, that one day decides, almost without consulting the mind, that enough is enough. If this silence was born to survive childhood, what does it cost to survive adulthood? This wall, made of invisible bricks, one for each unspoken resentment, is exactly the kind of pattern that no one teaches you to dismantle on your own. And it's not about blaming childhood or being stuck in it. It's about finally understanding why keeping things bottled up became a habit and how to replace it with something lighter. The digital book, The Divine Path That Guides Your Zodiac Sign Towards a Life of Purpose, works precisely on this internal reconstruction, helping those born under Taurus to recognize where silence has become a prison instead of protection. It's a resource designed for those who are tired of repeating the same pattern without understanding where it comes from. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. The second reason for this distance has a name, but it's rarely spoken aloud. Loyalty that no one asks to be demanded in return. Taurus offers support, presence, practical help, without making a fuss and without expecting applause for it. It's almost automatic. Someone in the family needs them, and they show up. They don't even need to be asked twice. The problem is that this delivery almost never comes with a clear request for reciprocity. It's like a bank account that only receives deposits month after month and is never consulted by anyone, not even the owner, until the day someone finally looks at the statement and realizes too late that the emotional balance dried up a long time ago. This dynamic often goes unnoticed for years because, on the outside, everything seems to be working. Taurus continues to help, remains present, continues to be the one you can trust. But inside, silently, a question grows. Why am I always the one who remembers, who solves problems, who shows up first? And the most uncomfortable thing is that this question is rarely asked of others. It stays only inside, fueling a weariness that no one else can see. There's a specific trap in this Taurus loyalty. The more trustworthy someone proves to be, the less others feel obligated to be grateful, because trustworthiness turns into expectation, and expectation is rarely accompanied by explicit gratitude. No one thanks the sun for rising every day. And that's how the family treats this loyal Taurus, as something guaranteed, predictable, that will continue to be there regardless of any reciprocal effort, until the day it's no longer there. Another important detail is that Taurus rarely asks for help, even when desperately in need. Asking seems, to them, a form of weakness, or worse, a way of becoming a burden to those they have always tried to relieve. So they carry everything alone, solve problems alone, and only show their exhaustion when that exhaustion has already turned into distance. It's not pride in the shallow sense of the word. It's a deep, almost unconscious belief that their worth lies in how much they can hold, not in how much they can ask for. What happens when that account reaches zero and nobody on the other side even noticed it existed? A Taurus's breakthrough rarely comes in the form of an explosion. Most of the time, there isn't that memorable argument that everyone will remember later with a specific date and time. What happens is more like a dam that doesn't burst all at once, but loses pressure drop by drop, day after day, until one day, without any special warning, it simply can't hold anything back anymore. Those on the outside often look for a specific reason, a poorly worded phrase, a missed event, an ill-timed comment, but that's almost never it. A Taurus's definitive withdrawal is the result of accumulated frustration, not a single incident. It's the weariness of years of giving without receiving, of perceiving without being perceived, finally reaching a point where continuing as before is no longer possible. And what confuses the family the most is precisely the absence of drama at this moment. There's no yelling, there's no ultimatum, there's just one person who suddenly stops insisting, stops demanding attention that never came, stops trying to fix alone something that always needed two hands. This moment is often misinterpreted as sudden coldness, when in fact it is the opposite. It is the end of a long and silent attempt to keep something alive on its own. While the family only sees the final result, the estrangement itself, they rarely see the years of invisible effort that came before, the phone calls that came only from one side, the dates remembered only by one person, the gestures of care that never returned in the same proportion. There's something almost spiritual about this kind of silent surrender. It doesn't stem from malice, it stems from exhaustion. And exhaustion, unlike anger, doesn't scream. It simply recedes, gently, like a tide that ebbs without warning, leaving behind only the mark of where the water used to reach. If the breakup wasn't caused by anger, where exactly did it come from? It comes from a quieter and more painful place than anger. The weariness of loving alone for too long, and recognizing this in yourself or in someone in your own family is the first step to preventing this dam from bursting completely. The digital book, The Divine Path That Guides Your Zodiac Sign to a Life of Purpose, proposes precisely this type of inner work. Learning to communicate your own exhaustion before it becomes definitive distance, and understanding that asking for reciprocity is not weakness, but necessary maintenance of any bond you want to keep alive. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. There is a third reason, more silent than the other two, and rarely acknowledged even by those experiencing it: the need to build one's own roots, far from the soil where it all began. This tends to happen more strongly when the family of origin, for whatever reason, was the first place where Taurus learned what instability was. A seedling doesn't grow strong competing for space in an already saturated pot. At some point it needs to be replanted in suitable soil, with nutrients it doesn't share with anyone else, to finally stretch its roots at its own pace. For many Taurians, distancing themselves physically or emotionally from their family of origin serves exactly this purpose. It's not rejection, it's the only way they've found to stop competing for a space that has always been too hotly contested. This explains why, often, the separation coincides with a phase of personal reconstruction, a new home, a new routine, a different way of organizing one's life. It's no coincidence. It's Taurus finally choosing where to plant its own roots, instead of continuing to try to survive in land that has always been too saturated to sustain further growth. This search for one's own ground is often accompanied by a silent guilt, because Taurus deeply values the idea of family, and distancing oneself from it, even out of necessity, seems to contradict everything one believes to be right. But there is a huge difference between giving up on a root and simply giving it the space it needs so as not to suffocate. A tree that grows too close to another never reaches its true height, not because it lacks strength, but because it never had enough space to stretch its own branches. Over time, many Taurians realize that this initial distance, so feared and so burdened with guilt, is precisely what allows for a healthier reconciliation in the future. Because only after establishing their own base, their own security, their own land, can they return to their family of origin as a whole person, and not as someone who is still trying to survive within it. What if distancing yourself from your family isn't abandonment, but the only way to finally flourish? Recognizing this need for one's own land completely changes how one perceives one's own separation, and it is precisely at this point that many Taurians find in the digital book the divine path that guides your zodiac sign to a life of purpose, a practical map for this reconstruction without guilt and without haste. It helps to understand that seeking one's own ground does not erase the love for one's origin. It only ensures that this love survives in a healthier way. The link is in the first pinned comment. The last copies are running out. Click now and begin your journey towards the clarity and genius you deserve. In the end, perhaps the right question was never why Taurus distances himself from his family, but what he's trying to protect when he does so. And the answer, however strange it may seem at first, is almost always love itself. The silence that seems like indifference is, more often than not, a way of preventing resentment from turning into war. The loyalty that bleeds on its own is proof of a care that never knew how to ask for anything in return. And the search for his own land is not an escape. It is the only path he found to return one day, whole enough to rebuild what was left unfinished. There is something profoundly human in this contradiction of Taurus, loving so much that sometimes it's necessary to distance oneself to prevent that love from becoming corrupted. Like a land that rests for an entire season before blooming again with greater strength than before, this distancing is not the end of the story. It's just the silent part of it, the part that nobody films, but that sustains everything that comes after. If you recognize something of yourself, or of someone you love, in these three reasons, Perhaps the most important message of this video is not to judge those who have distanced themselves, nor to demand explanations from those who are still processing it internally. It is simply to understand that most of the time, behind every Taurus's silence, lies a love that no longer knows how to express itself without getting hurt again. And understanding this is, in itself, the first step towards any future reconciliation being gentler than the last attempt was. And perhaps deep down, the greatest proof of love a Taurus can give is precisely this: choosing to be silent for a while, to keep their roots safe, so as not to miss the chance to one day return whole, with the same strength as always, but with a peace that they had never been able to sustain before. There's a silent beauty in all of this that goes unnoticed by those who only look from the outside. The earth never blooms during drought. It waits, protects itself, concentrates everything that is most essential deep down, far from the sun that could burn what is still too fragile to be exposed. And that's exactly how a Taurus loves their family. Even when distance seems to say otherwise, there's a whole, living root waiting for the right moment to bloom again. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because, in the end, that's what the earth has always known how to do best: to keep, to sustain, and to bloom again, exactly when no one else expected it. There's a question that almost no one asks aloud within a family. Why did this person, who was always so present, begin to gradually disappear? It wasn't a fight. It wasn't a move to another city. It was just a silent, almost invisible distancing that no one can quite explain. If this person is a Taurus, there's an answer that's rarely given because it contradicts everything you believe about this sign. Everyone repeats that Taurus is the most home-loving, the most loyal, the natural guardian of the family. And yet they can distance themselves like no one else. This is not a contradiction, it's protection. And there are 3 psychological reasons behind this behavior that practically no astrology content explains properly, because they don't come from zodiac books. They come from childhood patterns, unrequited loyalty, and an almost biological need to build security on one's own ground. The first reason is hidden in a silence that no one has learned to decipher. The second stems from an emotional debt that was never repaid. And the third, the most uncomfortable of all, has to do with a root that needs to be removed from its place of origin to avoid suffocation. If you've ever distanced yourself from a family member, or if a Taurus has distanced themselves from you without a clear explanation, what follows will likely explain something you've felt for a long time, but never quite managed to put into words.